Hey everybody, my name's Ray. This is the beautiful Berkeley Marina, Berkeley, California, and you're watching Qlik Branch. Let's do some coding.
So now that we've got the engine up and running, the next thing we have to do is we have to create our web app so that we can actually connect to the engine. So for this tutorial, we're going to be using a React web app. Now, there's nothing specific about React that is necessary for you to be able to connect or use the engine, but React is a very simple framework for you to prototype with and for you to build out very quickly. So that's why I chose React as the framework to use for the front end. So to get started, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run npx create react app, and we're going to say app. So what npx does is it's actually a command from npm, which is Node Package Manager, and it goes out and finds this command inside the package, the npm registry, and it'll download that package just to use for your specific command. So we're looking for the create react app package, and then we're going to say create a react app in our current folder with the name app. So when we do npx create react app, we have npm go out and fetch all of the stuff, and it's going to create an app folder right here. It was very quick for me initially to get create react app because I already had it installed. But for you, it might take a bit longer. And then when it's actually creating the app, there's a lot of npm installation that happens. So I'm going to use some magic video editing so that we can get through this really quickly and it doesn't take up too much of the video. So the npm install is done, and now you can see that we can start by going into our app and type npm start. And so what npm start does is it runs React script starts, which will start up a web server locally, so on localhost port 3000, and it will run your actual React project. So we look here and we see, oh, look, this is the standard beginning of a project created with create react app. So we look over in here and we have our app folder. Now, throughout this tutorial, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that I do that's pretty specific to React. And as I'm doing them, I will describe what each of them is, what each of the different pieces are. But I think for the sake of time, I will also be including an indication to you of where to fast forward in this video if you don't care about all the React stuff I'm doing and you just want to get down to the Qlik core stuff. So from this point until later on, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up everything for React. So I'm going to start by deleting this test file because I know that I don't need that and I don't care about that. I'm going to delete this logo because I know I don't want that. I'm not going to be using a service worker, so I'm going to remove this service worker from the index file, and I'm going to remove this service worker file. So there's a bunch of initial stuff that I can get rid of here. My index file is going to be okay from that point. The only other thing, though, is that there's some CSS that needs to change here. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to import a URL. And this is just a font that I have decided to use for this this project. And then I'm going to set the body to be a nice, to use this font in the first place. And have a backup font in case that one doesn't load. I'm going to set the background to be a nice dark but not quite black color. And I'm going to have my default font color to be white. So that's what I'm going to need for here. In terms of my app, I'm going to start with a blank because I will be adding in some stuff. in a minute, but I'll just empty that out right now. And I will update the CSS so that I'm just going to be using Flex for my layout. So that's good. And now I'm going to want to create two components. I'm going to create a header component and a main component. So for my header, I'm actually going to be importing some CSS for it. And I want to include a logo. So I'm going to create an assets folder here, and I'm going to actually include a separate file. So let me go in here. If we look in this assets folder, okay, perfect, I've got that. And then I want to import this logo. And I'm going to add an alt attribute because you should always be mindful of accessibility. Add a class in there. And so now I want to create some CSS for my header. And in here, oh, sorry, I didn't. So header, I'm going to give a margin, some padding, display, put a border on the bottom of it. And justify my content to put space in between everything. And then my logo, I'm just going to give a height to so that everything has some proportionality there. So that'll be it for my header component. My main component is going to be fairly easy from the beginning. This is just some CSS that I'm adding in here for future reference. So if you've never used React before, what we're doing here when we're creating our components is we are exporting a function. And this function returns what is called JSX. If you don't know what JSX is, it's basically the ability to include HTML type elements inside of your JavaScript. So by doing returns like this, we are able to actually return HTML from a JavaScript function. So when you create a React component, you have to import React in order to be actually able to use things like JSX. And then the component that you're creating here returns the JavaScript, the HTML elements that you want inside of your React component. So that's what I'm doing here. This is pretty basic. I'm importing an image and then into a variable, and then I can actually set the source of this image tag to be that variable. When you use curly braces inside of your elements like this, it's actually just a way to programmatically plug in variables into attributes. So there's my main and my header, and then in my app, I can actually include these things like this. And you've seen that I'm now importing header and main like this. I can get rid of this logo file. Check in here and everything seems to be compiling correctly. And then if we look over here, we can see that now we have, so I've done all the code that kind of sets up things the way that to look from the beginning. So if you look at our local host now that's being rendered by the React scripts, you can see we now have our header with a logo and we have our main space. So now that I've set up all of the React stuff for this video, we can get into how we actually want to connect to the engine. And so in order to do that, we're actually going to create a service. So we'll create, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it services. And I'm going to create an Enigma service. And to make things easier for myself, I'm going to actually use a class, a JavaScript class, which is available in the later versions of JavaScript and will be transpiled correctly by the React scripts in order to be usable by a browser. So one thing that I do want to do is I need to import the library that we're going to be using, which is Enigma.js. So from my app directory, I want to do an npm install enigma.js. And if you didn't see the previous video where I explained Enigma.js, Enigma.js is a JavaScript wrapper around the Qlik Core WebSocket API. So it allows us to interact with the Enigma or the Qlik Core engine very easily through a JavaScript library. So now that I have that, I can import Enigma. And another thing that I have to import, if you remember from the data load, is I have to import the schema. And I believe we're using 12.170.2. So now I want to create an Enigma service, an Enigma service class. And it'll have two variables in it. One will be the kicks variable and one will be the document variable. So what the kicks variable will be the global object that gets returned from opening my session. And then the document will be a reference to the actual app that we're going to be opening up, which is our movie app. I'm also going to create a static instance variable, and the purpose of this is just so that I can create a singleton. If you don't know what a singleton is, it means that we're going to be able to use this Enigma service in any component inside of our app, and it will all reference the same connection, the same app, basically the whole same thing. So that instead of importing individual Enigma service instances, we're going to be using this one singleton instance. And then I'm going to want to create a init function. And what this init function will do is it will let us know that we're creating a session. And this is where we're actually going to create the session and store all the variables. Enigma.create. So the variables that we're going to need is we're going to need the schema, we're going to need the URL, which for our sake is going to be localhost port 19076, which is the port that we set up when we were standing up the engine. We need to set the create socket variable, which is a function that will get passed the URL, and we want to return a WebSocket. So another thing that we should do is we should install WS. Actually, no, we don't need to install WS in then this instance. This is my, let me turn on my do not disturb. This is my, WS is what we used on the Node.js side, but because we're using this in the browser, we can actually take advantage of the browser's WebSocket. So we can just say new WebSocket. Which will go out to the browser's WebSocket API and use that. So we create that session, and then we will say that the session has been created, and we're connecting and opening the session, and we will set the kicks variable to the result from opening up the session. And await is having an issue. Oh, because we didn't put an equals there. Perfect. All right, so once we have our kicks variable, we can say that our document is going to be kicks.open doc, right? And we specify the name of our document, which in our case, if we remember here in our documents folder, is movies. So movies.qvf. We say that, and we know that we've got our document, and we'll specify that, and then we will return that. And I don't think we're going to need to take advantage of that return at this point, but it's nice to have the document be returned with the init. So now what I'm doing is I'm just kind of setting up my singleton a little better, so that when we want to create an instance, we just create one Enigma service, and then we say get instance. And what we do is we check to see whether or not there's anything inside of that static instance variable. And if there isn't, then we will set it. Create instance, and then we return that actual instance. And then finally, to make sure we take full advantage of this singleton, what we'll do is we will create a variable here which references get instance, and we will export that as our export for this whole Enigma service component. So the important Qlik stuff that we've done here is we've created a session that references our local engine. We've opened it, we've opened up the document, and then we've returned it. So that's the very important stuff that we've done there. Now we have to actually set it up to connect. And to do that, we're going to go back to our app. So we'll use a little bit of state. We're going to use a couple of things called React hooks, which are basically easy ways to deal with things like state and management, the state of components, the state of variables and of components in React. So we're going to use one called useState. And what useState does is it allows us to hold on to variable information in between creations of the component. So there is an interesting way that React handles components in that every time a component needs to be re-rendered, it reruns this function. So every time it needs to re-render, it will rerun this app function. And in order to be able to hold on to the state of variables like Enigma initialized, which is what we're going to use here, we need to use a hook so that when the new when this function is run again to re-render this component, we have to go back and grab the state of our variables that we were setting. So right now what we're doing is we're creating an Enigma initialized variable, and that'll tell us whether or not Enigma is initialized in our state. And the other thing we're going to use is we're going to use the useEffect hook in React. And useEffect is essentially a function that gets run every time the app or the component is re-rendered. So the reason why you would use useEffect as opposed to just doing code inside of the component is because you can set when a function is actually run. So if you were to set useEffect just like this without specifying anything, then that function would be run every single time that this function is executed. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually pass in an empty array. And the reason why we pass in an empty array is because we know that an empty array will never change. And so useEffect will only be run once at the beginning when the component is first rendered. And initializing our connection to the engine, we only want to have to do once. So what we're going to do is create a function in here saying that we want to take advantage of async and await, which is a concept in JavaScript that allows you to execute asynchronous functions. And in here, we want to set Enigma initialized, which is setting this Enigma initialized variable to the execution of Enigma service .init. And we need to import our Enigma service. Services/Enigma service. So now we've imported that and we want to do an init, and we're going to set Enigma initialized to the value that comes out of that, which is essentially going to be the document. Now at this point we're not going to do anything with that actual document, but we do know that that this value is no longer going to be false. So if we come back in here, we can rerun, and then when we look inside of our developer tools, we can see that we have actually created a session, opened our session, and opened our document. So this is exactly what we wanted. We are now connected to our engine, which is the end of this video. So if you enjoyed what you saw, please like. Don't forget to subscribe and update your notifications so that you get notified, because we're going to be posting more and more videos on how to work with Qlik Core. Feel free to join the Slack. We'll leave a link in the description. That Slack will get you access to our entire community, which is a very helpful community. So if you have any questions, you can get a hold of me or one of the other DevRel people like Woo sitting back there. And we'll be able to help you. Feel free to visit developer.qlik.com. That is our website that has a whole bunch of knowledge and projects and stuff around Qlik and all of its stuff. And we'll see you in the next video.